wasn't born as a vampire.
My clinical work is a very conscious blend of Jungian, post-Jungian, relational psychoanalytic, and humanistic elements. I don't like to say I'm eclectic or integrative. I prefer to see each of these strands existing in healthy competition in me with the other strands. This I call pluralism. Pluralism is not about reaching an agreement or a synthesis or a hybrid or anything like that. It is about knowing your various strands of interest and expertise. So I no longer call myself a Jungian analyst. Sometimes I call myself a relational Jungian, but increasingly I call myself a psychotherapist and prefer ultimately to be a therapist. I'm a therapist. One of the things I'm working on at the moment as a therapist is the centrality of the client in the clinical project. I don't just mean that the client's important, I mean the client is actually the motor of therapy. One of the problems with the stress on the therapy relationship, and I wrote a chapter in a book called Shadows of the Therapy Relationship, which is a critique of relational approaches to psychotherapy. One of the problems about all of this stress on the relationship is that it leaves out the individual we call the patient or the client. John Norcross, who is one of the most important psychotherapy researchers, and Michael Lambert, equally important, both have stated that the importance of the client to therapeutic outcome has been underplayed and underestimated. I mean, everybody knows it doesn't much matter what the tradition of the therapist is, what school they come from. That isn't really very important. And even the personality of the therapist isn't necessarily that important. But we all thought that it was the therapy relationship that did the business. But actually, even more powerful than the therapy relationship is the contribution of the client, where the client is in her trajectory of change. That is what drives therapy. That is what cultivates therapy. And there is a body of literature on this now, which I'm adding to. From the humanistic side, person-centered psychotherapist Arthur Bohart developed the idea of the active client, and I've taken that a bit further and talked about the activist client, using activist both literally, politically oriented people, and metaphorically, a certain kind of contribution that the client makes. To my mind, this is absent from classical Jungian analysis, just as it's absent from most classical variants of therapy, because they tend to stress the therapeutic relationship, which is obviously important. You can't say it's absolutely irrelevant, let's forget about the therapy relationship, but there's a problem with this, which is that it overlooks the contribution of the client. So although I have moved in a relational direction, I am still keeping an eye on the specific contributions of the two individuals involved in therapy, qua as individuals. And in this sense, I am a very traditional Jungian, because I don't think Jung really delved into the interaction very much. There's many ways in which he was relational, but in terms of interaction with patients, I'm not sure that he really was what a modern relational person would recognize. For the avoidance of doubt, I'm not saying the therapy relationship isn't important, and I'm certainly not saying that I don't get involved deeply in a relationship with my clients. I do. But I also think that there's a series of other problems with the stress on the therapy relationship. I think it's become really rather conformist and rather bourgeois, really. You know, you have to enter a relationship with your therapist. Who benefits from this, really? I mean, I think the therapist certainly does. And all the stress on safety, secure attachment, and so on. which our clients are said to need, and many of them probably do need, but not all of them need it all of the time. The stress on safety benefits and protects the therapist above all, and this needs to be stressed a great deal more than it usually is. I'll say something about Jung as a pioneer of relational psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I think it is the stress on what the analyst brings to the picture, his or her history, personality, and so on, is what Jung considers to be relational. There's less stress in Jung on interaction, but he's certainly aware of the importance of the personality of the analyst, the wounded healer story, and this cliche by now that you cannot take a client further than you have gone yourself, which, by the way, is rubbish. It's nonsense. I mean, what a castration of the client and a depreciation of the client's contribution and potential to say the client cannot go further than the analyst, and my Jungian colleagues still parrot this. It's really a big mistake, okay? Nevertheless, in his writings on countertransference, which stem from the 1920s, which I have distributed widely in the relational psychoanalytic world and which are finding their way into all kinds of books and papers by the New York relational people, these ideas on countertransference are way ahead of their time, because psychoanalysis was still stuck in a Freudian notion that the heart of the countertransference was the neurosis and resistance of the analyst. And it was Jung who was the first one to say that countertransference, in his word, is a very important organ of information. And he talks about psychic infection taking place within the therapy process, and he doesn't necessarily mean anything awfully negative about that. These are forerunners of our ideas about projection and introjection. They're forerunners of Racker and complementary and concordant countertransference, and I could go on and on and on. Jung was a pioneer, but I don't think his work really appreciated the contribution the client makes. If you read Jung's very few full case histories, there are virtually none, and his numerous vignettes, most of which sound to me a little bit invented, you will see that the best analogy for the client and patient is of a student. That the analyst teaches and the patient learns. Now, Patrick Casement, who I respect very greatly as a British psychoanalyst, who wrote a book called Learning from the Patient and who has been my supervisor for 12 years, he stresses, what the therapist gets from the client, whereas Jung is constantly stressing what the patient gets from somebody he calls, rather quaintly throughout the collected works, the doctor. That the patient gets lessons from the doctor. And I remember the British Jungian, famous man, Michael Fordham, who was very interested in Kleinian psychoanalysis and worked with Winnicott, and so he wasn't a very conventional Jungian at all. And I wrote about all of this in a book called Jung and the Post Jungians. But Michael Fordham said that this is how typical classical Jungian analysis works. The patient comes in with 2 copies of the dream typed, okay, one for the therapist, the analyst, and one for the patient, and then the 2 of them analyze a third thing, the dream, or whatever the material is. The material is not between. It's over there. They might work together a little bit on it, but mostly what happens is the patient brings something in and puts it there. And the Jungian analyst, at its worst, doesn't always happen like this, but at its worst, analyzes something over there. And then the patient talks about what is over there as if it's over there, but it isn't actually. Not only is it in the patient, but what we know about relationality and intersubjectivity suggests that actually the moment therapy is joined, what the patient brings is already part of a loop involving some, I wouldn't like to say suggestion in a negative sense, but let's just say some input from the analyst. There is no clinical material. There is no clinical material. There's only co-constructed stuff that should stay between the two people. But unfortunately, both in traditional Jungian and traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, there is something over there. In both traditional Jungian and traditional Freudian analysis, the stuff to be worked on is brought by the client. I seem to make myself the client and you're the analyst. Anyway, it's brought by the client, placed over there, and now you go to work on it. And actually, if you have a book on your bookshelf that shows that that image was also, I don't know, some Minoan image, very like it, you go and get your bookshelf and you show your book from your bookshelf and you show your client and you say, here, look, isn't it interesting? This is the collective unconscious. This is at its worst. I want to talk about the sexual hypocrisy of many analysts, especially in connection with promiscuity and polyamory. I think things have moved on enormously in terms of what we still call, stupidly, sexual orientation. I mean, orientation is north, south, east, west, so I always think sexual orientation means how you have sex rather than... Anyway, doesn't matter. Basically, the whole canon is monogamous. The whole clinical canon is monogamous. Even gay analysts and therapists writing about working with gay clients and patients still use monogamy, consistent patterns of relationship, as the yardstick. They may not only valorize that, but that's in there as a yardstick, as a kind of thing against which other things are measured. But promiscuity and polyamory are not discussed enough by therapists. I've given a lot of workshops on this matter, and I'm very interested in playing around with the idea of promiscuity. For example, there are people who have numerous sexual partners, what they call in the dictionaries of definitions of promiscuity, casual sex. I mean, promiscuity is anything but casual, by the way. It's incredibly planned and directed and followed through with great intensity. It absolutely isn't casual, but never mind. That casual sex is seen as problematic because it lacks depth, it lacks maturity, it lacks proper object relations. And of course, these are very questionable generalizations to make. Let's leave aside the promiscuity of analysts and therapists, which if you go to any conference, you will know is legendary. The corridors of the conference hotel are filled with the pitter-patter of therapists' feet as they trot into one another's bedrooms if they get lucky. But the client is supposed to stay kosher. And this is very much a part of relational psychotherapy. The few people I know, including me, who have spoken about non-monogamous, non-committed sexuality have got slaughtered. Yeah. Polyamory is something that we need to think about a lot more as well. And here Jung is very interesting because, of course, he had a polyamorous relationship, but advised people, as far as I'm aware, to enter into polyamorous relationships. I'm, of course, talking about Tony Wolff. It's still very difficult to get the Jung family to give Tony Wolff her place. And I'm going to say something now that I'm very happy to be out there in the public domain, which is this. Everyone knows how central the Red Book is to the Jungian industry right now. But Tony Wolff, in the apparatus, editorial apparatus to the Red Book, is so downplayed you'd even wonder if she existed, and yet Jung said, didn't he, that she stopped him from tipping over into madness. Why did the editors do this? Was it perhaps to keep in the good books of the Jungs? Is that why people who work closely with the Jung family don't like to talk about Jung and anti-Semitism, his activities in the 1930s, because that would upset the employer, in a sense the employer. There is a deep scholarly corruption in the Jungian world, which is not something that I feel needs to be laid at the door of individuals. I think it is something that the Jungs have realized they can do to us. We need them. We need their permissions to the right libraries and archives and all the rest of it. And there's a price to pay, which is sanitization. I have had a lot of problems with the Jung family, and I'm happy to retell for the camera something I've posted many, many times, actually. I was asked by William Maguire to do a new edition of Jung's book from 1946, Essays on Contemporary Events, where he discusses the 30s, the war, Hitler, and so on. And I did it. It doesn't matter what I did it. And it came out in a little edition that Routledge and Princeton did. And 11 years later, I got a call from a well-known academic who was working for the Jungs to say that the Jung family wanted the whole edition pulped, destroyed. Why? Because in the introduction, I said that maybe what happened with Jung in the 1930s involved his shadow. And they felt I had no right to say that. In fact, of course, it was a friendly thing to say. I was saying, it's not as bad as some people claim. It's the shadow. It's the shadow of a great man, blah, 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 all of that kind of thing. But they said, no, you can't say that. I then found 5 books that they'd given permission to be published that talk happily about Jung's shadow, including the famous one on Jung and anti-Semitism, which is called Lingering Shadows. Okay? So there was something else going on, and I don't know really what it was. And the edition was destroyed, and the new edition came out, and the editorial apparatus of the new edition is unsigned and makes no mention at all of the ongoing furore about Jung and the Jews and anti-Semitism and Germany in the 1930s. You just think this was essays on contemporary events. What the contemporary events are, not made very clear. So I have publicized this and put somewhere on the web, I can't remember where actually, my introduction and the new introduction and the old back flap copy and the new back flap copy. And in the middle of this, I get a threat from the Jung family. We're going to sue you for this. So I said, go ahead and sue. Fuck off. And they did. They fucked off. They do threaten to sue, and I think it's very silly. And there was another story too, which again everybody knows in the Jungian world, but this film may be a good place to say it again. Richard Knoll wrote an awful book called The Jung Cult. I'll come back to this terrible, stupid book in a moment. Just before he wrote this book, he edited a little book for Routledge and Princeton on Mithraic themes and issues in Jung's work. I think it was called Leoncephalus or something like this. Totally competent scholarship, nobody batted, in fact it was totally ignored, okay? After the Jung Cult, which I repeat for the avoidance of doubt, was a shitty, silly, deranged book, the Jungs ordered Routledge and Princeton to pulp, destroy the edition I just mentioned of the Mithraic stuff. You shouldn't do this sort of thing. It's silly. It just attracts attention of the wrong kind and ruins what is a splendid edifice. Jungian studies, Jungian analysis, Jungian psychology are good things, but not when their owners behave like this. Now, to come to the Jung cult, the book has been slaughtered, but some things that Richard Knoll did need to be specifically castigated. At the time of the book, he wrote a short piece for the op-ed page of the New York Times, in which he compared Jung to cult leaders like Jimmy Jones of Jonestown, where hundreds of people were brainwashed into poisoning themselves and so on, and they published a picture illustrating the Jonestown massacre alongside or embedded in Richard Knoll's piece on Jung as a cult leader. So I'm very split here. On the one hand, I think Richard Knoll turned against Jung because he was not accepted for analytical training and did a very nasty thing. On the other hand, my sense of what academic freedom means is that his book should not have been accordingly pulped. His other book, his okay book. You don't destroy someone's book because they wrote about another one that you don't like. No one else is going to talk about this stuff, and I have to tell you, this is skewing it a bit too much in the negative. I think I better say something more positive. I like Jungian analysis today because it steers a very helpful, creative middle path between the kind of rigor and interiority of psychoanalysis on the one hand, and something much more, how can I put it, free thinking, even slightly hippie on the other hand. It's great because you can get an ecological Jungian, you can get a Jungian into I Ching, homeopathy, aromatherapy, reflexology, all of this kind of thing, and yet at the same time they know how to do serious clinical analytical work. So it sits in the middle of the spectrum of therapies. But what it cannot handle in the Western countries is the rise of CBT promoted by the insurance companies. We are as susceptible, if not more susceptible, to the threat that the CBT industry presents than other schools of therapy. Now, throughout this interview, I've been using words like industry, and I want to use a word like business, because I do think Jungian analysis is a business, actually. It's not just a profession. And some of my work at the moment basically asks, will it survive? What is the future? And I think that if it contents itself with an entirely esoteric, inward-looking way of doing things and thinking about things, whilst it will never fade away entirely, it will just diminish to a little kind of Rosicrucian or Madame Blavatsky type of thing. It has to get promiscuous, to get back to my favorite theme of promiscuity. It has to go out. It has to become exoteric. I thought I invented the word exoteric, and I just thought maybe I've seen this word somewhere, so I Googled it. Apparently it really is a word. You know that? Yeah, I didn't know because I'm not philosophically educated. So exoteric is what we have to be if we want to survive. And the other thing we have to do if we want to survive is we have to own our mistakes, whether it's not doing something about the length of time we've taken to respond to the concern over what Jung wrote about Africans. These are things that are mistakes, and it's better to own up to them, and then we might survive.
wasn't born as a vampire.